The Chinese nation is a world unto itself, often unknown or misunderstood by the West. This ancient people went from a century of civil wars and foreign subjugation to an unparalleled process of transformation under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. This process was marked by political and social turmoil, poverty, and death, but also by unification, stabilization, and a subsequent economic boom, which today is leading China to rise as the world's leading power. Two paradoxical men led this process. First, we're talking about Mao Zedong, and after him, secondly, Deng Xiaoping. With two considerably different forms of government, can we say that these two men are the fathers of modern China? And today, we're going to learn about their extraordinary story. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to support us by subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and leaving your comments. We always read them all. By activating the bell and notifications, and above all, by sharing it with all your friends on social media, on WhatsApp, and anywhere else. With nothing more to say, let's begin today's video. Mao Zedong was born in Shaoshan, Hunan Province, on December 26, 1893. He was the eldest son of a strict and severe farmer who had risen from poverty to become one of the wealthiest farmers in the province. While his mother was a devout Buddhist, Mao adopted his mother's Buddhism until he abandoned the faith in his mid-teens. While working on his father's land and studying at school, Mao was a voracious reader and would remain an avid reader throughout his life. As a young man, he read works by Chinese authors mourning China's decline, along with translated classics by Adam Smith, Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Charles Darwin, and others. He found inspiration in the military valor and nationalist fervor of figures like Napoleon Bonaparte and George Washington. At the age of 16, he moved to the city of Changsha to attend high school. Revolutionary sentiment against the Chinese imperial monarchy was strong in that city. Mao Zedong sympathized with Sun Yat-sen, the nationalist leader of the revolutionary movement, who supported turning the Chinese empire into a republic. Since the mid-19th century, China entered what would later be called the Century of Humiliation, a period of internal fragmentation with successive interventions by Western powers that resulted in serious geopolitical and economic defeats for China, like the case of the famous Opium Wars. During these years, China was also influenced by popular Western trends like Republican, liberal, scientific, and democratic ideas. By 1911, the Xinai Revolution was consolidated, ending the monarchy and the legendary Qing dynasty, and proclaiming the new Republic of China officially in 1912, a clamor that came from reformist, nationalist, communist, and other groups. Mao, 18, served as a private in the rebel army but did not participate in the battle. By 1912, he resigned from the army, and back in the city, he read about socialism for the first time and began to take an interest in these ideas. He also showed special dedication to physical activity and community affairs. In the following years, Mao Zedong enrolled in and dropped out of various institutions, from the police academy to the law school, without finding a clear direction in his life. At the same time, he deepened his study of classic works of history and politics. Finally, in 1914, he enrolled in an important school in Hunan that trained future teachers. There, he was elected Student Society Secretary and organized protests and rallies. By 1917, he was elected to command the Student Volunteer Army in order to protect the school from bandit soldiers. Mao Zedong began to take an interest in warfare techniques and expanded his circle of friends and acquaintances who were enthusiastic about politics. Lo Zedong would graduate from this institute as third in his class. By 1917, Mao Zedong moved to Beijing, where his mentor got him a job as an assistant to the Peking University librarian named Li Dazhao, one of the future founding fathers of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao would join Li Dazhao's study group and very quickly adopt Marxist ideas and even anarchist ideas. There in Beijing, he lived under rather precarious material conditions and several of his peers mocked or looked down on his distinctly rural Hunan accent and his peasant background. Mao leaves Beijing and begins teaching history at a school in Changsha in Hunan. There he led protests and strikes opposing the Hunan province governor. He started a magazine where he wrote about politics in a conversational, persuasive style. Very active in political organization, he also got involved with manual workers, organizing them into unions and promoting night schools for them. Persecuted by the governor of the province, Mao flees again to Beijing. He realizes his articles gained notoriety in the revolutionary movement and starts seeking support in Shanghai to overthrow the Hunan province governor. He meets an old professor and a general, both former members of the Nationalist Party of China, or Kuomintang, founded with the Republic of China in 1912. This general was also planning a coup against the governor of Hunan, and Mao decides to support him by organizing the students. So in 1920, with Mao's help, the general took the city of Changsha, causing the governor to flee. In the new administration, Mao was appointed as the director of an important school, and his income increased significantly. There he married Yang Kailu that same year. It's important to highlight that although the Republic of China was founded in 1912, the stability of this regime lasted very little. Beginning in 1916, the country became even more fragmented, dividing into areas ruled by military warlords. These warlords did not answer to the Beijing central government, which in the 1920s controlled only a small part of China, then a primarily agricultural country. In addition to this, in 1925, the Nationalist Party rebelled against the government in Beijing and established its own government in the southern city of Canton. But going back to 1921 that year, the Communist Party of China was founded. Mao, who already had many acquaintances among the founders of the party, established a branch of the party in Changsha. That year, the first Congress was held with delegates from small Marxist groups in major Chinese cities, including Mao representing his city. Through multiple tactics and in a skillful way, with his wife, an activist for women's rights, Mao began building the party from scratch in his province. His success in organizing the miners in the region earned him a place on the party's central committee. Adopting the advice of Lenin, who sent his Soviet delegates to China, the Communist Party agreed to form a temporary alliance with the bourgeois Democrats, as they called them, with the Chinese Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, to promote a national revolution. Members of the Communist Party joined the Nationalist Party this way. Mao embarks on this mission and soon rises to become the head of propaganda for the Kuomintang, where he would be vocally anti-imperialist. Mao worked actively for several years in the Nationalist Party, witnessing firsthand how peasants in different areas began to take land from large landowners, convincing himself of the revolutionary potential of the peasantry. These were revolutionary times, with each region of China like its own world. Sun Yat-sen, leader of the Nationalist Party, dies. He is succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek, who, unlike his predecessor, focused on marginalizing leftist Kuomintang sectors and communists nationwide. However, Mao and many other communists continued to support the National Revolutionary Army, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who launched the famous Northern Expedition in 1926. This expedition was historic for defeating both the Chinese warlords and the unrecognized Beijing government. China was reunified in 1928 under a new nationalist government, recognized nationally and internationally, and based in Nanking. But as we will see, the new Kuomintang government would last very little as a stable and unifying government of the nation. After winning the Northern Expedition, Jiang Jieshi ended the Kuomintang's alliance with the Communists, who already numbered in the tens of thousands in China. In Shanghai, Jiang Jieshi launched the White Terror, killing over 5,000 communists in the city. Similar purges occurred in other cities, causing the Communist Party to lose over 15,000 members. Then the communists who were inside the Kuomintang were also expelled. So the Communist Party decided to take up arms, and thus in 1927 the long civil war began. China. The Communists founded the Chinese Workers' and Peasants' Red Army to fight against Kai-shek. Mao was appointed commander-in-chief of the Red Army and led 4 regiments in an attack against the Kuomintang government in his home province of Hunan. However, the defection of 1 regiment ruined the operation, and he retreated to the Jinggang Mountains with 1,000 survivors. Mao focused on setting up a base of operations in the mountainous town of Jinggang, where he unified 5 villages under a self-governing state. There, the lands of various landlords were confiscated. Some of them were re-educated while others were executed. The dynamism that this region acquired attracted local sympathizers. Mao Zedong formed an army of about 1,800 troops enforcing strict rules and instant obedience. All land confiscations should be handed over to the government, and nothing should be confiscated from poor peasants. It's worth mentioning, although not widely known, that Mao was a prolific writer of political theory, military strategy, philosophy, and even poetry, both before and after coming to power. His writings on war, guerrilla tactics, and political strategy have been and remain studied by leaders in many countries. Returning to the Jinggang Mountains, Mao's troops were called by the party's Central Committee, and for months the troops moved through the Hunan region, carrying out some successful operations and others that failed. Uniting with another communist regiment, although Mao's regiment was the only one mainly made up of peasants, the main goal was to push for a massive peasant uprising. By 1928, at 35 years old, Mao married his second wife, an 18-year-old revolutionary who would eventually give him 6 children. Mao had to leave the mountainous region with his troops due to the hostility of the area and the bad behavior of some of his soldiers. He was ordered to disband his peasant guerrillas, but Mao refused. For their part, the Soviets maneuvered to replace the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party with the new Chinese cadres, who had been educated in the Soviet Union and were aligned with the Soviets rather than with the Chinese. Mao, from the beginning, viewed this unfavorably and became the main rival of this new Politburo. By 1930, in the region controlled by his troops, Mao established the provincial Soviet government of Jiangxi. In November of that year, his second wife and his sister were captured and beheaded by a general of the Kuomintang. The Central Committee of the party moved to Jiangxi, and there they proclaimed the Soviet Republic of China, a self-governed communist state. They stayed in Jiangxi for 6 years as a republic during the Civil War. In a tense calm, the Kuomintang launched fierce campaigns against the Red Army and the Jiangxi Soviet. Outnumbered, Mao responds with guerrilla tactics. However, right at that moment, in 1937, amid the tensions leading up to World War II, the Japanese Empire, which already controlled a small part of China called Manchuria, decides to invade eastern and northern China, and thus begins what became known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. As a result, the Nationalist Army turns its efforts to fighting the Japanese and shifts its attention away from the communists. And as a result of this, the Red Army expands its area of control. But in the midst of the battle against the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek decides to launch a surprise campaign against the Red Army and the Jiangxi Soviet. Caught between gunfire, explosions, and shortages, the Red Army chooses to evacuate the city. With 85,000 soldiers and 15,000 party cadres, this became known as the Long March. Led by Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, they escaped west and north in circles, covering about 12,500 kilometers in 170 days. Amid constant battles and harsh roads, the Long March became the most important milestone in the Communist Party of China's history during its time in hiding. It marked the consolidation of Mao Zedong as the leader of the party and the defeat of his political rivals. At a conference during the march, Mao Zedong was elected chairman of the Politburo and became the de facto leader of the Red Army and the party, with Joseph Stalin's endorsement. Just a tenth of those who began the Long March made it to the end. Settling in northern China in Shaanxi, Mao Zedong decided that they should prioritize the fight against the Japanese, as this would help gain the trust of the Chinese people. In Shaanxi, they regrouped, recruited new troops, and formed a new 15,000-strong army under Mao Zedong. The Red Army's guerrilla offensive began in various territories controlled by the Japanese. They had already taken the city of Shanghai and the city of Nanjing, which was the seat of the Chinese nationalist government. Convinced of the need for an alliance with the nationalists, Mao sends a telegram to the Military Council of the National Government of Nanjing. Chiang Kai-shek rejects the proposal at first, but then is forced to accept it. And in 1937, an alliance is formed with concessions from both sides to fight the Japanese. Meanwhile, the Imperial Japanese Army commits the so-called Nanking Massacre after taking the city, killing tens of thousands of Chinese civilians. These events pushed many Chinese people to join the army, increasing the Red Army from 50,000 to 500,000 soldiers. The Red Army successfully attacks the Japanese in 5 provinces at once. Meanwhile, Mao continues writing texts on politics, philosophy, and war tactics for his troops to read. The war between Japan and China lasted 8 years and was one of the deadliest in Asia, with around 20 million casualties. After years of fierce fighting, the Japanese invasion finally ended with Japan's surrender during World War I. But this marked the resumption of the Civil War in China, now with greater involvement from the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. But the reality for the nationalist government was that it had been greatly weakened by the Japanese invasion, since it was the one that contributed the most human and material resources to fight it. Meanwhile, the Red Army actually used the situation to strengthen itself. In December 1949, the Red Forces, now called the People's Liberation Army, finally took the cities of Chongqing and Chengdu. This caused Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist troops to flee to the island of Taiwan, where they founded the so-called Republic of China, a state separate from mainland China, which still exists today and is popularly known simply as Taiwan. The communists finally took power in mainland China, with Mao at the head. This would mean the end of civil wars in China, stabilization, and the long-awaited unification. After a century of civil wars, foreign invasions, and a new turbulent era for the Asian country, in 1949, from Tiananmen, Mao declared the new People's Republic of China, adding a vast nation to the ranks of self-proclaimed communist countries. More than a third of the world's population now lived under governments of this kind. Mao's communist ideology was strongly influenced by Lenin and also had its own particular Chinese characteristics, starting with the large peasant population that the country had, and the absence of a proletariat with what would be called class consciousness by the Marxists within the party. There was a debate between the more orthodox communists and those who believed it was necessary to modernize the country in a Western style and then move towards socialism. Was Mao in favor of orthodoxy? One of his first actions was traveling to Moscow, where he secured key political, economic, military, and infrastructure agreements. Stalin shows his power and his willingness to support China. Mao also sends tens of thousands of troops to the Korean War, and in retaliation against the United States imposes a trade embargo on China. However, relations with both the Soviet Union and the United States would take an unexpected turn in the near future, as we will see later. Similarly, internal reforms in the Chinese economy and society begin, expanding party control and guiding the country toward the Maoist model. Less than a year after taking power, the so-called land reform movement was launched, in which the agricultural properties of the vast majority of landowners were confiscated in almost all provinces. These lands were handed over to the peasants under the form of cooperatives or collective farms, grouped into communes with property rights centralized in the state. This massive confiscation was achieved through violence, allegedly in every village. As exemplary punishment, at least one landowner was executed, and usually several. Land was distributed while removing potential regime destabilizers. This land reform led to millions of Chinese facing unemployment and hunger as production sharply declined. Likewise, in these early years, the campaign for the suppression of counter-revolutionaries in the city and in the countryside was launched to target those whom the party saw as economic parasites, promoters of bourgeois values, and political enemies in general. This meant between 1949 and 1952, the persecution and neutralization of tens of thousands of dissidents, from prominent businessmen to humble workers. Numerous suicides were also reported in major cities during this decade. Additionally, 1 to 5 million Chinese convicted of minor offenses were sent to the reform or re-education through labor program. This consisted of a large number of prison farms where these prisoners were sent to work, often until death. Likewise, Mao's government is often credited with substantially reducing the production and consumption of opium during the 1950s, which was a serious problem that plagued China. For more than a century, 10 million addicts were forced to undergo treatment. The traffickers were executed and the opium crops were replaced with other products. Literacy programs increased the literate population from 20% to over 60% in under 30 years. On a personal level, it is said that Mao smoked cigarettes in chain, excessively dozens of cigarettes a day, that he was dependent on powerful sleeping pills, and that he had a large number of sexual partners, in addition to the several wives he had. He had a rustic personality from his peasant background, sometimes being very introverted and other times very extroverted. He had a complex sense of humor and did not hide his aspirations for greatness or glory. After consolidating his power in 1953, Mao Zedong launched the first 5-year plan aimed at starting rapid industrial development in the sectors of iron, steel, electric power, building materials, and basic chemicals. Many of these plants were built with Soviet assistance, marking the beginning of China's rapid industrialization. Considering the Russian Revolution was partly funded by leading bankers from Germany and the United States, and when you consider the little-known phenomenon that much of Soviet industrialization was carried out with the help of major American companies and advice from American technicians, it can be concluded that China also indirectly was able to begin its industrialization thanks to the knowledge and technology that the United States supplied to the Soviet Union when both countries were supposedly in an existential conflict. To prevent an uprising in China similar to what happened in Communist Hungary in 1956, Mao relaxed certain policies and launched a campaign inviting citizens to express their proposals and criticisms toward the government, as well as issues in scientific and artistic matters. However, this only lasted for a year, and after this, Mao pushed the so-called anti-rightist campaign, a new massive purge in which he persecuted hundreds of thousands of dissidents, both inside and outside the party, especially those who were identified during this brief period of freedom of expression. Now, an unprecedented period of tragic proportions was about to come to China. In January 1958, the Chinese government launched the second 5-year plan, also known as the Great Leap Forward. It aimed to turn China from an agricultural nation into an industrial one. The agricultural cooperatives were merged into much larger people's communes, and many of the peasants were ordered to leave the fields to work on infrastructure projects. The collectivization of farms and livestock was intensified, unproven agricultural techniques were implemented, and private food production was strictly regulated. All of this, combined with droughts and floods, led to a substantial reduction in the production of grain and other foods. A large part of this production was sent to the cities by state order, and another part of that production simply didn't exist because officials in each region inflated the numbers. This led to what has gone down in history as the Great Chinese Famine, perhaps the most severe famine ever experienced. A country in the 20th century had an estimated 10 to 40 million deaths from 1959 to 1962. Due to the chaos, the economic program was ended in 1962, although it would leave consequences for many years afterward on the health of the population. During the Great Leap Forward, neither Mao nor any Chinese leader changed the policy, despite receiving multiple reports of severe shortages and deaths far above normal. Party officials went to the villages looking for food they believed was hidden, harassed, and ended the lives of hundreds of peasants. During these searches, while all this was happening, industrial production and investment in the construction sector increased considerably, as did the income of the industrial proletariat. Due to the disorder, Mao stepped down as president of China in 1959, but stayed president of the Communist Party and Central Military Commission. By 1962, he was finally forced to stop this policy. Mao was sidelined politically by President Liu Xiaoping and his close associate Deng Xiaoping, whose biography we recommend on this channel. Liu Xiaoping criticized the Great Leap Forward and started a short period of partial economic liberalization in China, easing severe shortages. But Mao would not stand idly by, and together with the Minister of Defense, he would plan his thunderous return to the spotlight. At the same time, Russia had been undergoing de-Stalinization, liberalization, and closer ties with the United States for several years due to multiple geopolitical factors. In 1962, China broke off relations with the Soviet Union. The bipolar Cold War turned tripolar. Mao Zedong called Russia revisionist and claimed to be the true communist. The Soviet Union withdrew its technical experts and economic assistance from China. So during the 1960s, China was internationally isolated, facing both the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. It would have, especially with Russia, moments of considerable tension during these years. On Mao's recommendation during Liu Xiaoping's leadership, an ambitious plan called the Third Front also began to be developed, which aimed to strengthen China against possible invasions by the United States or the Soviet Union. This plan led to infrastructure, telecommunications, iron production, and military defense projects, especially in the country's interior. After 4 years of government under Liu Xiaoping and Deng Xiaoping, with Mao on the sidelines of power, the great Chinese communist leader pushed forward in 1966 the plan he had been devising, the famous Proletarian Cultural Revolution. This was a social and political movement led by Mao and his most loyal followers, whose explicit goal was to purge Chinese society of its traditional feudal elements and the capitalist elements that had supposedly infiltrated the party. After denouncing the so-called revisionism of certain Chinese sectors, Mao's followers, especially the younger ones, formed paramilitary groups across the country called the Red Guards and Revolutionary Committees, which took power in different parts of the nation and replaced the traditional power structures. These groups banned and destroyed a large part of China's cultural heritage, including ancient buildings and artifacts, and above all, they ended the lives of hundreds of thousands accused of being anti-communist, with tragic massacres in Beijing and other cities across the country. Among those imprisoned was the president himself, Liu Xiaoping, who was accused of being a bourgeois and would die in prison 2 years later, in 1969. The top leaders of the most westernized and reformist sectors of the government, such as Deng Xiaoping, fled into exile. Thus, Mao effectively returns as the country's sole leader. The chaos grew so severe that Mao ordered the army to halt the Red Guard's excesses. Although the Party Congress a year later declared the end of the Cultural Revolution, Mao, like Trotsky, said that the revolution had to be permanent. Now, very paradoxically, after this violent campaign against bourgeois and capitalist elements, at the beginning of the 70s, the Chinese government began to approach Western countries, especially the United States, putting an end to its isolationist policy. Paradoxically, Mao does not entirely abandon the partially liberalizing policy of the previous president and Deng Xiaoping. The United States abandons its ally Taiwan to meet with the Chinese government. In 1971, Henry Kissinger met secretly in Beijing with Mao and his prime minister to negotiate diplomatic recognition and new relations. China's seat at the United Nations, which was held by the so-called Republic of China, known as Taiwan, was taken over in 1971 by the People's Republic of China. 1972. There would be a historic meeting between Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong as the absolute leader. In the 1970s, the internal struggles for Mao's succession also began. The faction led by Yan Qing, known as the Gang of Four, seemed to be the favorite. Mao Zedong's health kept deteriorating. His last photo and public appearance was in May 1976 during the Pakistani Prime Minister's visit after 3 heart attacks. Mao Zedong, perhaps the second most prominent communist leader of the 20th century, passed away on September 5 at the age of 83. The national radio announced his death while calling for party unity. Mao's embalmed body, along with the party flag, was displayed in the Great Hall of the People. 1 million Chinese people passed through the place to say goodbye to him. The portrait of Mao at the funeral displayed a message: continue Chairman Mao's cause and carry the proletarian revolution through to the end. But what was to come turned out differently. After his death, Maoist factions such as the Gang of Four were gradually pushed out of the party, and Deng Xiaoping's faction prevailed, initiating an unprecedented process of economic opening in the country, westernization, and the abandonment of many socialist policies, which would transform Chinese society. To this day, although the political structure remained intact and the party continues to be the supreme power in the country, thus ended the life of one of the most influential men of the 20th century in China. He is still seen as a father of the nation who, despite mistakes, laid the foundations for today's Chinese powerhouse. Meanwhile, the West remembers him as a harsh despot who brought much pain to the people he transformed. His life. It was anything but peaceful as an activist, revolutionary, strategist, military leader, writer, and president of a country that is almost a continent. His story is the embodiment of a deeper history, that of an Asian nation that today remains an exotic, misunderstood subject for many of us who do not live there. Deng Xiaoping, born under the name Deng Shansheng, was born on August 22, 1904 in Sichuan province. Deng's family was part of the Hakka people, a minority Chinese ethnic subgroup, clearly distinct from the Han, the majority ethnic group in China. The year Deng Xiaoping was born, China's imperial era was in its final years. Under the Qin dynasty, China was experiencing what would later be called the Century of Humiliation, a period of internal fragmentation in this country, with successive interventions and defeats of the Chinese nation by Western powers, like the case of the famous Opium Wars. Struck by foreign influences and unable to maintain internal order, the Qin dynasty was finally overthrown in 1912, and the Republic of China was founded. A clamor that came from nationalists, communists, and other revolutionaries. Deng's father, Deng Wenming, was a landowner who had studied at the University of Law and Political Science in Chengdu. His mother, whose surname was Deng, died early in Deng's life, and he had 6 other siblings. Deng began his studies at an early age, and his tutor would change his name to Deng Shiqiang. In 1919, at the age of 15, Deng graduated from school in the city of Chongqing. That same year, he and 80 fellow students traveled by ship to France to participate in the Diligent Work and Frugal Study movement, a work and study program abroad. His first job in France was as an installer at an iron and steel plant northwest of Paris, where he moved in April 1921. In that suburb of Paris, Deng met and began to meet with some prominent and future leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, and in June 1923 he joined the Communist Youth League in Europe. Later in 1924 he joined the rising Communist Party of China, and as soon as he arrived he became one of the main members of the general branch of that party in Europe. 2 years later, Deng would move to the Soviet Union to study at Sun Yat-sen University in Moscow, a university of the Communist International that functioned as a training camp for Chinese revolutionaries, both for the Nationalist Party, called Kuomintang, and for the Communist Party of China. Although the Republic of China was founded in 1912, by 1916, the country became more fragmented into territories ruled by military warlords. During the 1920s, the central government in Beijing controlled only a very small area of Chinese territory, which it should be said was a fundamentally agricultural country. At the end of 1927, Deng returned to China and joined the army of Feng Yuxiang, a military leader in northeastern China who was fighting against other local leaders in the region. The Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, was led by the respected Sun Yat-sen, who at the beginning of the 20th century was one of those who had established the Republic of China. For a time, the Kuomintang shared views with the Chinese Communist Party, which was founded later. However, after traveling to Moscow and studying Marxist doctrine, Sun Yat-sen decided communism was not the best path for a unified China. Sun would die in 1925, and the renowned Chiang Kai-shek would take the reins of the party and the republic. Chiang Kai-shek began a military campaign to unify the country and put an end to the warlords. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek tried to control northern China during the Northern Expedition. The Nationalist Party would break relations with the Communist Party and order what was called the April 12th Purge of 1927, where tens of thousands of communists were captured or killed. This event catalyzed the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. It was during the Civil War that Deng Xiaoping, who made up for his short stature, with great intelligence, quiet cunning, and a cool mind, he began to rise in the party and gain leadership. Likewise, this was the moment when he himself would begin to call and introduce himself as Deng Xiaoping and not as Deng Qiqiang. Deng fought the Nationalist Party army in multiple Chinese cities and fronts. First, he settled in the city of Wuhan, where the communists had their headquarters. There he met Mao Zedong and other prominent Communist Party leaders who would later govern the country. Han Kai-shek, with superior weapons and manpower, swept through much of the country. After several communist defeats, Deng managed to escape from Guangxi and later appeared in the city of Shanghai in 1931. Many of his detractors accuse him of having deserted the battle in a cowardly way to go to Shanghai. This weighed on him during the Cultural Revolution, but we'll see more about that later. From Shanghai, he would travel to Jiangxi, where the communists led by Mao Zedong were entrenched. Mao believed that the foundation of his struggle should be the peasants, so he distanced himself from the Soviet Marxist-Leninist rhetoric of urban proletarian struggle against the bourgeoisie. Chiang Kai-shek decided to attack this last stronghold of communists in Jiangxi. Surrounded by the most powerful army of the Republic of China, the communists were forced to flee and evacuate the city. This is how what is known as the Long March would begin. About 100,000 men left Jiangxi, and the march ended a year later, when only between 8,000 and 9,000 survivors, including Deng Xiaoping, reached the northern province of Jiangxi. This event was extremely important because it ensured the survival of the Communist Party. It strengthened the leadership of Mao, who would become the party's chairman, and also made Deng Xiaoping a prominent figure among his comrades. After several battles led by Deng Xiaoping, the communists brought the north of the country under their control. However, the civil war had to be paused because in 1937 the Japanese invaded the country. Both the Kuomintang and the Communist Party agreed to a ceasefire so they could focus on defeating the invading army. During World War I, Wan Duai-deng was seen by those close to him as a veteran revolutionary, highly respected for his fight against Japan and for his leadership during the Long March. Finally, the fight of the United States and the Soviet Union against Japan led to the Japanese leaving Chinese territory. In 1945, Deng would travel to Chongqing to negotiate an armistice with Chiang Kai-shek. However, despite Soviet and American mediation, the talks failed and hostilities began again between the nationalists and the communists. But the Japanese invasion had changed the balance of power, wearing down the nationalists and giving the communists the opportunity to regroup their forces in the north. The Kuomintang set up in Nanking and Isola, the republic's capital. But their armies, exhausted from fighting against Japan, did not have the strength needed to fight against the communists. They had been taking over rural areas for some time, using ruthless guerrilla warfare tactics, cutting off supply lines to the major cities that were in the hands of the nationalists. After several victories in which Deng played a key role, on October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed in Beijing under the leadership of Mao Zedong. However, the southern territories were still in the hands of the nationalists. Deng was in charge of the Southern Pacification Campaign, and little by little the Kuomintang was forced to abandon its major cities. The Communist Army, now officially called the People's Liberation Army of China, suppressed any nationalist resistance, forcing the Kuomintang to flee to the island of Taiwan. With the Kuomintang out of the equation, the Chinese Civil War was over, leaving a new republic in the hands of the Chinese communists. Mao Zedong thus takes control of a country of 600 million people and puts an end to a long period of weak central governments and national fragmentation. After briefly serving as Chongqing's mayor, Deng Xiaoping returned to Beijing in 1952 as vice premier and vice chairman of the Commission of Economy and Finance. Within the Communist Party, there was a debate between those who rejected abruptly changing the traditional culture of the Chinese people and those who considered it necessary to change the material conditions. By modernizing the country in a Western style, Deng was always in favor of the latter. The rise of Deng Xiaoping was rapid. By 1955, he was already becoming a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, that is, the top leadership of the People's Republic of China. However, Mao began to see him as a threat to his position, and the disagreements between them began to surface during the economic crisis and the so-called Great Leap Forward. In its early years, China's communist government relied heavily on Soviet economic support. Despite tense relations, Mao worried about the large Soviet debt and the countryside emptying as people moved to cities for industrialization. Mao decided it was time for China to move forward on its own, with an economic plan he called the Great Leap Forward. This consisted of the collectivization of the countryside through communes, advanced economic communities. The plan emphasized steel production and merging small and medium businesses with large industries. The aim was to modernize China's agrarian economy into an industrial one while still supporting the countryside. The economic plan had disastrous results. Agricultural output fell short of expectations, and the commune steel was so poor it was unusable. The plan resulted in significant reductions in grain production, cotton production, vegetable production, and livestock. In addition, there was an increase in inflation and a shortage of essential goods. This was followed by government harassment of producers who did not meet production quotas. All this debacle, along with other factors, led to the so-called Great Chinese Famine, an unprecedented economic chaos in which millions of people died of starvation. Depending on the source, between 5 and 55 million Chinese people died. This serious crisis caused a split in the Communist Party. Criticism of Mao began to emerge within the party, especially from the factions close to Deng Xiaoping, who at that time was the right-hand man of Liu Shaoqi, Mao Zedong's main rival, who advocated welcoming foreign investment. As a result of the 1962 crisis, Mao lost the confidence of the party leadership and was forced to hand over the presidency of both the party and the republic to Liu Shaoqi. From 1962 to 1966, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping started mild economic reforms. However, Mao went on the offensive. Though he lost his position as head of state, he kept the loyalty of the repressive forces and young cadres who adored him. That was how Mao Zedong launched the so-called Cultural Revolution. They persecuted and ended the lives of tens of thousands of people accused of being rightists, counter-revolutionaries, and traitors to the Communist Party and to Mao. Within the party, numerous members who were critical of Mao were also persecuted. Among them was Deng Xiaoping, who was removed from his positions and forced to move to the city of Jiangxi, where he worked in a tractor workshop. Liu Shaoqi, for his part, who was president and an ally of Deng, was imprisoned in 1968 and would die tortured in prison. Mao regained power, but Deng Xiaoping remained influential in the country's politics, so he would apologize and offer his loyalty to Mao, who allowed him to return to Beijing, and thus he regained his political positions. And although he didn't have the influence or power he had before the Cultural Revolution, he was still one of the figures seen as a possible successor to Mao. Mao, just like Stalin, died in power in 1976 and left Hua Guofeng as his successor. A weak politician. Within the party, a struggle began between Maoist leaders and Deng Xiaoping, who was once again stripped of his positions. Meanwhile, Western economic groups were increasingly influencing China, who saw China as a great business opportunity and were calling for its opening, like the Rockefeller Foundation, which had spent decades expanding its influence in China's financial, scientific, and academic sectors. Hua Guofeng couldn't consolidate his leadership, and critics of Hua viewed Deng Xiaoping as a stabilizing force, who from his voluntary exile in Canton requested to be reinstated into the party elite. Deng would return to Beijing, and on July 22, 1977, he rejoined the government, regaining his position as vice premier, vice president of the Central Committee of the Politburo, vice president of the Military Commission, and chief of staff of the People's Liberation Army. Once consolidated again, Deng would become the great enabler of the reforms that would change China forever. Although Hua Guofeng formally held the main positions in the party and the republic during 1978, Deng was the de facto head of state. He had the support of the bureau and the armed forces, and he was the one who exercised power directly. Once there, Deng would push forward an economic and political plan that would change the fate of China. Deng formulated a macroeconomic plan with 4 clear objectives, called the 4 modernizations: agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology. The first reforms were directed toward agriculture. That was the priority. At that time, 80% of China's population was rural. Deng started by ending Maoist collectivization and implemented the so-called responsibility system in production through family contracts with income based on performance. In other words, the former people's communes were now turned into private, cooperative, or individual plots. The peasants could now keep what they produced and pay a portion to the state. This measure alone increased production to remarkable levels, also raised the living standards of millions of farmers, and stimulated rural industry. By 1984, grain production had already increased by 56%. Another of the most important reforms was the creation of special economic zones for foreign companies, which would be exempt from many of the regulations. In these special zones, multinationals could settle and establish themselves under their own labor regulations. This gave rise to the famous Made in China, which enabled the relocation of multiple American and global industries and manufacturers to China to take advantage of the cheap labor, with this creating an economic dynamic that has been denounced by some as pseudo-slavery due to its working conditions. The truth is that the implementation of these policies led to the country's economic growth in many areas, but especially in terms of technological production, goods and services, and exports. This was the greatest example of the idea proposed by Deng Xiaoping for China, called One Country, Two Systems. And it's important to mention that, also influenced by the Malthusian policies of birth control in the West, Deng Xiaoping established the famous one-child policy, which has resulted in China facing a serious problem of demographic aging in the 21st century. It's very striking that despite the economic opening, Deng Xiaoping neither wanted nor needed to implement an opening at the political structure level. Unlike the Soviet Union, he knew how to implement all these liberalizing reforms in the economic sphere without opening new spaces of power and without westernizing the one-party political system, which has remained unchanged throughout all these years up to today. Despite the reforms, he established what became known as the 4 fundamental principles. 1. Perseverance in the socialist path, perseverance in the people's democratic dictatorship, perseverance in Communist Party leadership. 4. Upholding Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. In addition to strengthening rural industry, agriculture, and foreign investment, the initial reforms also aimed to strengthen industry in the cities. The central government gave certain freedoms to private enterprises to operate, and also partially decentralized the price system established by the government. This led to the disappearance of the rationing from the Maoist era. Industrial production increased, private companies began to grow, and in addition to this, the service sector started to expand in the country. China's economic growth under Deng Xiaoping also allowed the country to take a much more prominent place on the international stage. The West wanted to invest and do business in the country. After years of isolation, the United States went on to recognize the People's Republic of China, and he even visits President Jimmy Carter in Washington, and later visits the headquarters of major transnational companies in that country, making clear the new economic priorities for China's commercial and technological development. Likewise, this position of strength allowed him to negotiate with the United Kingdom's Thatcher for the return of Hong Kong and with Portugal for the return of Macau, under the logic of one country, two systems. During the 1980s, Deng continued to deepen the gradual and controlled liberalization of the economy, true to his calculating style. However, this economic process was not without its problems. By the late 1980s, high inflation caused a macroeconomic imbalance and triggered a political crisis. With the protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989, Deng's government quickly and violently controlled the protests with the army. This repression and the reported thousands of deaths marked a minor political and diplomatic setback for the Chinese government. However, Deng controlled the situation and maintained the deepening of the country's economic growth. By the 1990s, an elderly Deng Xiaoping had officially left his positions in the party, although he continued to lead from behind the scenes against other political rivals who sought to halt economic liberalization. In fact, in 1992, he reopened the Shanghai Stock Exchange, which today is one of the most important in the world, and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange. During this decade, the leaders loyal to Deng who followed him implemented a rapid privatization of companies. State rules on international private investment were eased. Inflation was reduced and China joined the World Trade Organization. After the Southern inspection, Deng Xiaoping retired from public life and became ill with Parkinson's disease. Deng Xiaoping would pass away on February 19, 1997 at the age of 92. Since the reforms initiated by Deng Xiaoping, China's economic growth has been rapid and sustained. Economists and international groups estimate China's annual gross domestic product growth at 9.5%. From the period of 1978, when Deng took power, until 2005, since the implementation of the reforms, China's gross domestic product has multiplied by 10. It is estimated that Deng Xiaoping's measures lifted between 500 and 800 million Chinese people out of poverty according to Western standards. There have also been people nostalgic for the old China, the China of Mao and Imperial China. Don't they already recognize a sovereign Chinese people separate from the West? In response to this, Xi Jinping has pursued a policy aimed at reviving old Chinese symbols and traditions. The Chinese case is of interest to the world as it rejects Western-style democratic and parliamentary forms. At the same time, it is economically prosperous and maintains unquestionable political stability due to the non-democratic nature of its government. In the West, there is little discussion about the legacy of Deng Xiaoping, who, based on the previous figures, could be considered one of the most effective statesmen of the 20th century. There is more discussion about Mao Zedong, the leader during the war who unified China, even about Xi Jinping, the current president of China, who has consolidated his power like no other leader and has put the country in direct competition with the United States on economic, diplomatic, and even technological fronts. However, that would be impossible today without the reforms and vision enabled by Deng Xiaoping. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I want to remind you that your support means a lot to us. Always sharing the content, leaving your comments, liking the video, turning on the notification bell, and interacting with the channel in general. Thank you all, and may God bless you.